Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This isn't just about lines on a graph. It's about improving people's lives. Working people are still feeling the pinch after a cost of living crisis caused by the party opposite that caused interest rates and inflation to go through the roof. So I am pleased that the OBR confirmed today that real household disposable income will now grow this year at almost twice the rate expected in the autumn. Compared to the forecast in the final budget delivered by the party opposite, and after taking into account inflation, the OBR say today that people will be, on average, over £500 a year better off under this Labour government.
The Chancellor Rachel Reeves delivering her spring statement. Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. Welcome to our special coverage of this statement on the public finances from the Chancellor.
So Rachel Reeves went into today with a big challenge, which was to address the fact that the public finances have gotten worse since the budget in October, but without either damaging her credibility with her own party or with the markets. A couple of very key numbers that we got out of this, and the key piece of information that's feeding into the announcements Rachel Reeves made is the latest assessment of the economy from the Office for Budget Responsibility. Growth is slower, half of what the forecast was in the last assessment by the OBR, 1% instead of 2%. And the question that Rachel Reeves had to try and address is how the gap created by increased borrowing costs for the UK on international markets was going to be filled. And what we got was announcements of further spending cuts and an upgrade to growth down the line from investments, which allowed her to restore the headroom for her budget by the end of Parliament, according to her fiscal rules. £9.9 billion was what she left herself after the budget in October. That was eroded, but she's now restored it with this round of latest announcements.
An immensely difficult task for this Chancellor, and one that has actually gotten more difficult as the Labour government has, got its feet under the desk. Rachel Reeves blamed a world that is changing before our eyes and a global economy that has become more uncertain for the issues that Britain faces. The statement included, as you say, the Office for Budget Responsibility slashing economic growth to just 1% for this year, yes, upgrading future years, also cuts to welfare spending. Very difficult, therefore, for the Chancellor to argue that this is a growth statement when actually growth is seen as being weaker and worse than we had expected. And yet the Chancellor went back, and perhaps markets will be reassured by her saying yet again, top of the list, that her fiscal rules are non-negotiable. She did say that her measures today, the things that she announced today, will restore in full her headroom. So we are back to the £9.9 billion pound surplus by the fiscal year 2029-2030 that sort of disappeared in the last few months as those borrowing costs went up. There will still be questions about that figure, though, and about whether that actually is enough headroom, given all of the uncertainties that we know are perhaps coming down the road.
Yeah, indeed. And the question of credibility with markets, key to all of this. Let's bring in our Markets Today editor, Dave Goodman, for a little bit more on this question. Dave, the announcements, many of which had been trailed in advance, things like the cuts to welfare spending that we'd heard about, the increased investment in defence. Talk us through the sort of overall picture that we got from Rachel Reeves.
Looking at the speech, in general, there weren't any big surprises in terms of announcements. We knew that welfare spending was going to come down. We knew that defence spending was going to go up. These are kind of well-trailed. Even the growth cuts you were mentioning earlier, I think them being cut to 1% was very much people's expectations. A couple of things were picked up on by the markets. During the course of Reeves' speech, she talked about day-to-day spending increasing for departments on a real terms basis. That gave investors a little bit of a shock, and gilt yields went up. But we've since then had the announcement for the DMO on financing for 2025-26, which came in just slightly below market expectations, which has more than reversed that move in gilt yields now, and they're heading lower. So we're kind of back to little change where we were before the spring statement, and given the recent history of UK fiscal events, that's for now it's probably a bit of a win for Reeves, I'd say.
OK, that's interesting. Rachel Reeves saying that day-to-day spending would rise by 1.2% in real terms. As you say, that was perhaps one of the few surprise figures in there. There is quite a debate, though, about how much spending cuts are going to translate from paper to reality. You know, the total welfare bill being cut back. You know, how difficult is that for the Chancellor to make those promises that welfare cuts will help and actually translating those into reality?
Yeah, I mean, these things are always slightly challenging, aren't they? Because you kind of can throw around these numbers in the statement right now, and then kind of, as you say, delivery is the problem, particularly with something like welfare, where there are a lot of moving parts and a lot of difficulties for the government in implementing things. I mean, I think for now the crucial thing is that the OBR has scored them, and they've kind of delivered around the amount of cuts that Reeves was hoping for. I think 5 billion was the figure that was the government were looking for, and it's about 4.8 billion. So broadly in line with that. So I think obviously that's the key thing. When you've got such reduced headroom like Reeves has, like just getting these wins in the OBR forecast is an important thing.
Interesting to see, as the Chancellor has finished speaking, the reaction in the bond market to the update from the Debt Management Office. So you mentioned that the overall projection for how many gilt sales there be, or the quantity of gilt sales in the coming year, lower than had been expected. But another question that we'd been watching out for the details of is the share of long-dated bonds that the government was going to be auctioning. So that's going to be cut much more, it appears, than had been expected. It's going to go down to 13.4% of bond sales. The expectation had been for that to be around 17%. How important is it that the UK is shifting to selling shorter dated debt as opposed to the longer bonds?
That's a really interesting question, because for a long time the UK's longer dated debt was seen as a real boost for the UK, and the fact that the UK's average maturity was well over 10 years was seen as a kind of sign of stability. But I think now the demands of investors are different, and this is why we're seeing that shift. And I think the market is seeing this move now as a positive, which you're seeing coming through within the reaction. I think when you've got interest rates that are higher now, then I think obviously locking ones in at these levels in for 30 years isn't ideal for the government either. So this is why we're kind of perhaps seeing this shift.
Meanwhile, Rachel Reeves was very clear in saying this statement does not contain any further tax increases. But as we think about the months ahead and potentially the main budget in autumn, there are lots of question marks about whether there'll be more pressure on government finances and whether, Labour will have to go to the big tax levers that they've said they wouldn't touch, and whether there will be tax increases further down the line. She was keen to say, not today, not now. What's the thinking about what happens in the months ahead? Yeah,
I think that's obviously the question mark hanging over this now. All today has done for Reeves' headroom is restore it to the levels it was in October, back to 9.9 billion against her fiscal rule by the end of that horizon. It's been a lot of work to get there in terms of these welfare cuts and other spending moves. So this is one lever they've pulled. But what's happened in the last 6 months is a reminder that headroom can be wiped out really easily by shifts in markets, some of which have nothing to do with the UK. Obviously, we've got the situation with yields were heading higher because of what was happening in the US, and obviously with tariffs and other things in play right now, it's quite hard to see where yields will go from here. So it's a very narrow amount of headroom to rely on. If come October we've had another shift higher in bond yields around the world, and that pulls the UK borrowing costs higher again, then things like tax rises are going to have to be on the table, it feels like, because the UK hasn't really got very many levers left to pull, and you can't keep on ruling all these things out before you kind of come back and look at these big revenue rises.
Dave, we could find ourselves doing this all over again in October. For now, our Markets Today editor, Dave Goodman, thank you very much for joining us. So, The markets appear to have given their verdict in the immediate aftermath of the speech by Rachel Reeves, and certainly that key question of how much the UK is going to have to borrow to keep itself running, and the structure of that debt as well being welcomed, it seems, by the markets as well. I do wonder, though, a lot of these messages, you know, there's good and there's bad in it. If we talk about the growth forecast, obviously it's been halved, but Rachel Reeves pointing to the OBR giving a vote of confidence to their planning reforms, for example, saying that's going to boost growth over the long term. Exactly the sort of headline that Rachel Reeves wants to have as well. Interesting too for her to point to real incomes and how households will be better off by the end of the Parliament.
Yes, and I wonder whether this £500 that she mentioned, that the OBR says that households will be on average £500 a year better off compared to the forecast at the final budget under the Conservative government. Is that going to have cut through? I think you can argue it both ways. Every parliament wants to see living standards increase. So obviously it's a good thing that they potentially could. And yet you could say £500 increase over the lifespan maybe of the government is a pretty paltry number and yet absolutely necessary. So I wonder how much cut through that will have with voters when, of course, we're still a long way off from any major election.
Yeah, indeed. So just to go through, I suppose, some of the other things that the Chancellor did announce, mostly measures that we had heard about before. So the changes to welfare are very key in focus there. Rachel Reeves saying that the overall package will save £4.8 billion, but there's an investment aspect to this as well as them reducing or scaling back certain benefits. There's going to be extra money for job centres and for the Department of Work and Pensions to try to reform the way that welfare is paid too.
Yeah, if you can't work, you should be properly supported. I think properly in that statement from Rachel Reeves is very important. So yes, I think on welfare reforms that's very interesting. Also on transforming government, she talked about making our state leaner and more agile. £3.25 billion of investment to transform the government and how it is run. Also trying to cut down on tax evasion. I mean, how much will these measures have an impact?
I mean, I do feel like every chancellor that gets up in Parliament to make a statement like this talks about cutting tax evasion, and the results of it perhaps not as easy to measure as we might expect. The other key element of this announcement as well, flagged in advance, is increased investment in defence. The government laying out its ambition to speed up the process of getting to 2.5% of GDP in spending on defence as well, talking about some of the individual projects and that. Interesting to see the extra capacity for UK export finance going to be part of that too. That's an extra £2 billion there as well. And this commitment to invest 10% of the equipment budget in the MOD in new technologies as well, with a focus particularly on small businesses. So perhaps that's another filter through aspect. Of course, the Chancellor will be hoping that stimulates growth as well and helps to, I suppose, when we look at these calculations again, perhaps offset if there's any bad news in the form of tariffs that comes down the line, that this may help to be one of the factors that boosts economic growth.
Again, it depends how you look at this. We are living in more uncertain times, we know that, and yet the Chancellor talks about the opportunities in a changing world from defence spending.
Thursday morning on Bloomberg Radio and Television, we'll be hearing from the Chancellor Rachel Reeves. For more on the measures that she announced today, we'll be hearing from her live at 8:40am London time, so do join us for that.
That's it from us for today. Thank you so much for listening to our special coverage of the Chancellor's spring statement. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. You can give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Woolcock. Our audio engineer was Sean Guastamacchia. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with more at the end of this week. This is Bloomberg.